That was beautiful. Thanks to the chorus, and thanks to our new choral director, Ariana Bella. A round of applause for her. Johnson Chapel is the heart of Amherst. The first time I saw it was the day I was presented to the community as Amherst's president. I remember that the space seemed bright and the people assembled seemed friendly, but the rest is a blur. Partly because just before I walked into the chapel with the chair of the Board of Trustees, the search committee members, and my predecessor, President Tony Marks, Tony had leaned over and asked me what I was planning to say in my speech. What speech? No one had mentioned to me that I'd be expected to give a talk. You could, of course, say, well, you should have known you wouldn't be expected just to stand there and say nothing. But I had not planned to give a talk. I spoke then, as I did last week, to those of you who are new students about what drew me to Amherst. And I think I said exactly the same thing then as I did last week. The quality of intellectual life here, the beauty of the campus, and the challenge that Amherst has invited on itself to create a diverse intellectual community in which every term in that phrase has as much meaning as the second one has always had. Amherst seemed devoted to what mattered to me, an education aimed at freeing us from ignorance, bigotry, and limiting loyalties, and devoted to pursuing truth, something that still matters, truth. The second time I entered Johnson Chapel was in the middle of the summer, before my term as president had started. I had brought a close friend out from Boston to see the college, and I talked her into climbing up the steps to Johnson Chapel, to this chapel. And I saw it then as if for the first time, because I hadn't really seen it the first time. The chapel was not yet air-conditioned. It was sweltering inside. The doors had been shut and the windows had been closed. And I found the chapel forbidding. It was only partly because of the heat. It was mostly, I think, because of the portraits. With their dark backgrounds and their stern-looking men, I felt intimidated. I realize that now. At the time, I just probably felt critical, but that often happens when we're anxious. But I have come to love this space, this chapel, and not only because it's air-conditioned. It was really a matter of learning who these men are. There were no portraits of women in the chapel when I came. But I have learned who these men were and are and what they achieved. And every single one of us, when we're new and even when we're not, has to find a way of inheriting a history that is not our own and may be or feel extraordinarily unfamiliar to some more than others. One way that I found, or I actually was given, to help me attach to a history that I didn't know much about was the opportunity to add portraits and also to switch some of them around. At the time, there were no portraits of faculty members who were only faculty members. There are former presidents. Most of these portraits, by the way, are former presidents and trustees, alumni who became trustees. The first 6 presidents are on the second floor on the back wall. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the people on the front wall. So we had the opportunity when I got here to hang a portrait of a faculty member who had been a faculty member for 50 years. And her name is Rose Alver, and her portrait is right here. She joined the faculty when the student body was still all male. She blazed trails for women faculty by mentoring and supporting, and she also blazed trails for the women students who were to be added in 1975. It's when the first women students began here. She was a beloved professor and a faculty leader. She was on every major faculty committee. She left a lasting mark. She was incredibly witty, say her friends. She is said to have gotten the job when the chair of sociology went to Harvard and was invited by her to the Harvard Club for the interview, but she had to go in a separate entrance at Harvard for women, and the chair of sociology went through with her. Clearly, she got the job. I remember my correspondence with her when we wanted to hang her portrait in the chapel. She knew that we had acquired the portrait with the aim of hanging it in the chapel. But Greg Call, the then dean, told me that Rose probably wouldn't like the idea of having her portrait hang in the front in so visible a spot. And he was right. And it was good that he forewarned me, because I then wrote her an email in which I anticipated that she might not like the idea, and explained to her, truthfully, that it was both about her, but more importantly about the symbolism of having the faculty represented in a visible place as the core of the college. And she wrote back, I still have the email, under those conditions, I concede. And there she is. And at the same time, the brilliant then Chief of Staff and Secretary to the Board of Trustees, Susan Pecor, who's sitting in the balcony tonight, and I decided we might move a couple of other portraits around. I wanted Charles Hamilton Houston to hang at the front of the chapel. Do you all know who Charles Hamilton Houston is? No, how would you know? Some might know. Susan had the idea that we needed to reframe the portrait to give it a presence that it didn't have, because it's a smaller portrait. Now, why did it seem important to have his portrait hanging in a visible place? Charles Hamilton Houston, who is right above me, his portrait, was the architect of the legal strategy that resulted in the desegregation of schools when Thurgood Marshall argued and won Brown v. Board of Education, ending segregation. Justice Thurgood Marshall argued the case and deserves great credit. But Thurgood Marshall said of Charles Hamilton Houston that he did, quote, all of it. And how did he do all of it? By devising a strategy that took a long view, that started with a demand for equality of these separate professional schools in the public sector, knowing that there was no way the states could actually make the professional schools for African Americans and for whites equal. And he built precedents that led to Board v. Education. That's Charles Hamilton Houston. When he was at Amherst, he was the only black student. He came here at the age of 16. He graduated from Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa, was chosen to give that year's commencement speech, 1915, when he graduated, and went on to Harvard Law. Last year, one of our trustees, Phil Jackson, gave a talk about Houston to new students in which he said, Charles Hamilton Houston is the best of us. And I think he's right. And there are other bests of us too. We had an opportunity to add a portrait over here on my left, your right, of Richard Wilbur. Richard Wilbur is one of the great American poets whom we lost just last year. He's a graduate of Amherst College, and he taught here for many years before his death. He was Poet Laureate of the United States and won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for poetry. An amazing human being. Here is Joseph Hardy Nishima. He illegally left Japan on a boat for China, which he sneaked onto, and then from China came to Boston. And the captain of that boat made it possible for him to pursue an education. He was the first Japanese citizen to receive a baccalaureate degree, and he did this in the 1800s. Calvin Coolidge on the very, oh wait, there's Joseph Nishima here. I pointed to Calvin Coolidge when I meant, I'm really practicing imperfection, and I'm practicing making friends with it, as I asked you all to do. I'm sorry. This is the 30th President of the United States and a graduate of Amherst College, Calvin Coolidge. He's not a President of the United States about which many people know much. He also served as the governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and was known as a Republican progressive. William Hastie was Charles Hamilton Houston's cousin. He also graduated from Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. He was also a brilliant legal mind. He was the first black federal judge and the first black federal appellate judge in the United States. He was the first governor of the U.S. Virgin Islands who was African American. He was on Harvard Law Review soon after leaving Amherst for Harvard, and he did as much to end discrimination in this country as his cousin, Charles Hamilton Houston. This is Richard Wilbur. It's hard to look backwards. My sense in deciding to talk about this a little tonight is that you are in a position of needing to inherit the history of Amherst in your own way. And I'm not sure, even though you've attended many events already in Johnson Chapel, that anyone has talked to you about the chapel or told you about the people who are portrayed here. There are just a few points I want to make. There's not enough time to talk a lot about the history of Amherst and how you might adopt some of its history, but there are a few points that I think are worth making, in which we can take some pride, or at least note how interesting they are. First of all, who founded the college? Amherst College is not named after a benefactor. Harvard was at the time, Williams was, Dartmouth was. Amherst was not. And why was it not named after a benefactor? Because Amherst was founded by a group of what people often refer to as ordinary townspeople. And there was not a benefactor who could give the kind of money that would have warranted naming the college. Amherst was named, people often say, named after the town of Amherst, but actually it was founded and supported by a group of men who were the board for the Amherst Academy at the time and who named it after the academy. So it's once removed from the town, in fact. These men were so determined and so passionate to have a college in the town of Amherst, and people in surrounding towns were equally passionate and determined to have a college here, that they persevered through enormous fights to get one. If you look at the seal of Amherst College, you'll see that it has chartered in 1825. It was founded and opened in 1821, but it was not able to get a charter until 1825. And why was that? Well, Williams and Harvard opposed the charter for Amherst in the legislature. Harvard arguing that it would lose prestige if there were a college founded out here in the west of Massachusetts by people who were Orthodox Congregationalists, Calvinists, in fact. And Williams feared the competition for students. They still do. Now, just a little about the difficulty. There was opposition in the legislature because of the Orthodox Calvinism, the rural location, and Harvard and Williams. Williams had a reason to resent Amherst a bit, however, because our first president, Zephaniah Swift Moore, whose portrait hangs upstairs here in the back next to the door, had actually been the president of Williams. And he left Williams because he was convinced that Williams could not survive in so remote a location. I'm not making this up. And in fact, Williams was losing students and was struggling financially in the 1818 to 1821 and even earlier. And there were trustees of Williams College who thought it might make sense to, as they put it, remove the college from Williamstown to Amherst and to unite the colleges. Well, the fights went back and forth. At one point, the trustees of Williams decided that Northampton would be a better location to which to remove the college, Williams College, and that Amherst should not be the site of a new college in the Commonwealth. And I love reading the descriptions of the meetings in which Noah Webster, the lexicographer, author of the dictionary, spoke here in the town of Amherst and gave a speech that won over those who had initially supported Northampton as the site of the college. So this is only a little bit of a great deal more detail. It teaches you about the importance of rhetoric, the importance of eloquence, the importance of persuasion, the importance of learning and knowledge. Webster had graduated from Yale and moved from New Haven to Amherst. And were it not for Noah Webster, who was probably the one best known founder and member of the Amherst Academy Board, the Unitarians in Boston and the wealthy folks who eventually were persuaded to support Amherst may not have been persuaded. Second point, before Amherst was founded, the founders of Amherst College had raised a charity fund. So I like to think about that they had chosen before even founding the institution and opening its doors to raise money so that indigent, poor young men of piety could get a free education. So Amherst actually had an endowment. The charity fund became its endowment. It had an endowment in order to make education free for poor young men before it opened its doors. It opened its doors in 1821. People sometimes think that raising money as a responsibility of the president is a fairly recent phenomenon. People have forgotten that there was never a time when private liberal arts colleges did not rely on the generosity of townspeople, of alumni, of people from all over the state and indeed sometimes the nation who had a passion for education, who thought education for its own sake was an absolute necessity to the health of the region, the country, and when the time came, the democracy. If you read about the work of the early presidents and every president who's ever stood in this chapel, every single one of them faced financial difficulty, and every single one of them spent a significant amount of time raising money and working to persuade those with means that education is worth supporting. It's sad to think that we live right now in a moment when there's so many critics attacking higher education at a moment when its value and necessity has never been clearer. Amherst has relied on and been able to depend on the generosity not only of its own alumni and donors, but of townspeople and citizens who believe in education for almost 200 years. And then, finally, what one learns from reading detail about the history of the college in its early days is what it takes to make a college. What is a college? The core of a college is the faculty and the students. But a college also needs buildings and facilities. When this college opened its doors, it had 2 faculty members, around 30 students, and a president. It had 1 building, and some of you live in that building right now. The first building was South Hall, South College it was called. What was the second building built at Amherst? No, not North. That was the third. The second building, and I always giggle because Tony Marks said to me once, can you believe the priorities back then? They thought they needed the second building to be a president's house, and that's what it was. So the first building was South College. The next building was not the current president's house, but a different one that the president found moldy and inappropriate, so this is the second iteration. The third building was North College. The fourth was Johnson Chapel. And why is it called Johnson Chapel? Because a farmer outside of Amherst left $4,000 in his will to the college, and it was used to pay part of the building of this chapel. There were no architects involved in the building of any of these early buildings. Something that, hello? I think it's genius. College Row is genius. Think of it. This row of buildings on the hill, yes, they're spare. Yes, they're simple. Yes, Professor Hitchcock, the geology faculty member, who eventually became president, criticized them and attacked the designs and had the octagon built to show, yes, you're laughing, to show that Amherst College could do better than these original buildings. Well, to have a college, it takes faculty, it takes students, it takes alumni, it takes trustees, it takes donors, it takes administrators, sorry, but it does. And it takes a population that believes in the importance of education. I had wanted to talk to you all tonight about something entirely different, and that is a book I read this summer that maybe some of you have read or heard about, called Educated. It's a book that's been on the New York Times bestseller list for many weeks, and it's a book that moved me profoundly, and I will just spend 1 page on it. It's a memoir, and it's the story of a young woman who grew up in Idaho, off the grid in a survivalist family. So much off the grid by the time she was a child of about 4 or 5 or 6 that her father no longer allowed the children to go to school or to see doctors. She and her brothers experienced trauma of a sort that is almost unimaginable, and yet her powers of description make the traumas and the abuse they endured so vivid that it's very hard to put the book down. It's called Educated because without any schooling of a formal sort, and with the help of an older brother who made it out, so to speak, she ended up at BYU, having never taken classes anywhere, but having taught herself enough math to pass an entrance exam. And from BYU, with the support of faculty and a bishop, She ended up at Cambridge University. She spent a year at Harvard, and she eventually got her PhD at Cambridge in intellectual history. And she has written a book about what it means to be educated. It is powerful, it is moving. It is not a perfect book. There is no perfect book. But if you get a chance to read it, and even if you don't, I hope you'll agree with me that the freedom to think for oneself with others and with the support of a faculty of the quality you all have the opportunity to study with here is a gift that we cannot allow to be eroded. We have to fight for the form of education, a liberal arts education, which is a form that has never been better suited to the world in which we live. Take good advantage of the education and the support that this faculty is about to offer you. Make good use of it. It's a gift. It's easy to take things for granted. Just don't. Don't. This is no longer a religious college, but the space and the project of the college is sacred. Thank you very much, and have a good semester.